Have you ever met someone who completely changed your life by accident? This is a story about a poor mechanic, a broken-down luxury car, and a woman who wasn't just running from her past. She was hiding a secret that could change everything. Thought he was just fixing her car. He didn't know he was about to fix something far more fragile. Her heart, and maybe, just maybe, she'd fix his too. If you love stories about unexpected love, second chances, and the quiet magic of kindness, you're in the right place. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that just might move your heart. Now settle in. Let me tell you what really happened when a poor mechanic fixed a girl's car only to discover she was his soulmate and a secret billionaire. The morning light in Pine Creek always came gently, a soft gold washing over the snow-dusted mountains like a whispered promise. But for Eli Turner, it arrived with the crank of an old coffee pot and the creak of worn boots across a concrete floor, still cold from the night before. Eli's garage sat at the edge of town, tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a diner that served the same 5 meals it had since 1953. The faded sign above the shop door, Turner Auto Repair, leaned slightly to the right, as if time itself had nudged it there and then moved. Eli didn't mind. He liked things that leaned, bent, a little broken. He was in his late 30s, but the years had settled early on him, not in wrinkles, but in the quiet weight of someone who'd carried too much without ever asking for help. Tall and lean, with oil-stained hands and kind eyes the color of rusted copper, Eli moved with a quiet rhythm, like a man who didn't rush because he knew the world would. Each morning, he swept the shop before the first car arrived. Not because he had to, but because it felt right. In a world of fast fixes and throwaway promises, Eli still believed in doing things with care, even if no one was watching. Today it was the silence he noticed first. No phone ringing, no engine ticking. Just the low hum of the heater and the distant sound of the wind brushing pine trees, like a song only they could hear. He poured a mug of black coffee, chipped at the rim, and leaned on the counter. On the wall hung a picture of his father, Tom Turner, mustached, proud, and forever frozen in a 1970s mechanic jumpsuit. Tom had built this shop from scratch, taught Eli how to fix anything with a motor and how to treat every customer like family. That was the thing about Eli. He didn't just fix cars, he restored dignity. The bell above the door jingled, and in came Mrs. Halverson, the widow from up the hill, wrapped in 3 scarves and an expression of pure exasperation. "Starter won't budge," she grumbled, rubbing her gloved hands together. "And I've got Bible study in 20 minutes. Think you can work a miracle?" Eli grinned. "I'll do my best. You pray, I'll wrench." It took him 12 minutes to get her old Subaru running. She offered to pay, as always, and as always, Eli waved it off. "You bring me a slice of that lemon pie next time. We'll call it even." He watched her drive away, then stood a moment, longer in the crisp air, watching the sunlight glint off the snowbank like glass shards. It wasn't much of a life, but it was honest. Inside, he scribbled something in his ledger, a habit inherited from his father, and reached for another sip of coffee when a strange noise reached his ears. A purr, then a cough, then silence. Seconds. Later the sound came again, this time louder, angrier. A car, high-end by the sound of it, struggling in the cold. Eli stepped out of the garage just in time to see it. A cherry-red convertible pulling up, the engine sputtering, steam hissing from under the hood. It parked unevenly, front wheels crunching. Snow. The door swung open and out stepped someone he hadn't seen before. She was young, maybe late 20s, wearing an ivory wool coat that didn't belong in a place like Pine Creek. Her hair was tucked beneath a cashmere beanie, and her eyes, framed in just a hint of mascara, were scanning the garage with obvious uncertainty. "Hi," she called out, her voice firm but cautious. "I think Something's wrong with my car. Eli nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. Seems like it. He walked over, not too fast, not too slow. What happened? I don't know, she said. It just started smoking on the highway. I took the first exit I could find. Eli leaned under the hood and gave a low whistle. Radiator's leaking. Could be a cracked hose or the whole thing's about to give. You're lucky you pulled off when you did. She looked genuinely alarmed. Is it fixable? Everything's fixable, he said. Then, after a beat, mind if I take a better look? She nodded and stepped back, arms crossed, gloved hands gripping her elbows like she was bracing for news she didn't want to hear. Eli worked in silence for a few minutes, aware of her watching him. Most people got bored quickly, phones out, scrolling. Not her. She was just watching, like she was studying something unfamiliar but oddly comforting. You're not from around here, he said, half buried under the hood. She let out a soft laugh. That obvious? He smiled but didn't press. When he finally straightened, she tilted her head. So, what's the verdict, Doc? You're gonna need a new radiator. I can order one today. Might take a couple days with the snow. You in? A hurry? She hesitated. Not really. He wiped his hands again, this time a little slower. You got a place to stay? Actually, no, I was just driving. I wasn't planning on stopping. Eli nodded toward the diner next door. Best grilled cheese you'll ever have. And Doris, the waitress, knows every motel in town. She smiled. Thanks. Name's Eli, he said, offering his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, warm. Sophie. Nice to meet you, Sophie. There was something in the way she said her name, like she wasn't used to introducing herself, like she was used to people knowing who she was before she said a word. But Eli didn't recognize her. He just saw a girl with a broken car, kind eyes, and a half-hidden sadness that felt strangely familiar. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed his just for a second, accidental. Or maybe not. And just like that, the stillness of Eli's world cracked, not loudly, but enough to let something unexpected in. Eli watched from the garage doorway as Sophie disappeared into the diner across the street. Snow swirled around her like a film scene, light, cinematic. Something about the moment felt different, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way she looked back before the door closed behind her, not with suspicion, not with discomfort, with curiosity, like she was trying to remember something about him. He shook his head and turned back to the shop. There was still the matter of her busted radiator. He set about ordering the part, but his thoughts kept drifting, floating back to the way her voice softened when she introduced herself, or the faint trace of hesitation in her words, like she was walking a line between who she was and who she wanted to be. He'd met plenty of wealthy folks before, people from Aspen with second homes and trust funds. They had a way of carrying themselves, as if the air was thinner around them, and they didn't need to breathe like the rest of the world. But Sophie wasn't like that. She had polish, sure, but under it, Eli had sensed something raw, maybe even lost. 2 hours passed, and Eli had just finished patching up a delivery van when the bell above his door jingled again. Smells better in here than that diner, Sophie said, holding a white paper bag and 2 coffees. Eli raised a brow. You came back. Didn't realize I needed your permission, she teased, stepping over a coiled air hose with surprising ease in her heeled boots. I'm just not used to customers returning voluntarily, he said with a smirk. They usually don't, and come back unless the check engine light's on again. Well, she said, placing the bag on the counter, maybe I'm not like most customers. Eli lifted the flap of the bag and smiled. Grilled cheese and curly fries, still warm. He picked up one of the coffees. Black? She nodded. Same as yours. Dangerous assumption. I took a chance. They sat at the small workbench near the front window, normally cluttered with nuts, bolts, and coffee-stained manuals, Today it was cleared, wiped down, almost respectable. Eli didn't even remember doing that. Sophie took off her coat, revealing a cozy forest green sweater that clung to her in all the right ways, but somehow looked effortlessly modest. She noticed Eli glance at it and gave a half smile, clearly used to being observed. "You really fix cars here all by yourself?" she asked, looking around the modest space. "Yup. My dad used to run it before me. I started helping when I was 15, knew how to rebuild a carburetor before I could drive." "That's kind of impressive," Eli shrugged. "It's just what I know." There was no false modesty in his voice. Just a man who'd learned to do things with his hands and didn't think that made him special. But Sophie saw something in it. A steadiness. A kind of confidence that didn't come from money or attention, but from simply doing something well, day in and day out. "You ever want to leave Pine Creek?" she asked suddenly. Eli hesitated, wiping a smudge of grease from his palm with a napkin. "I used to think about it. Maybe somewhere with more opportunity, but now, I don't know. There's something honest about this place." "Honest," she repeated quietly. "That's rare." Eli tilted his head. "Where are you from, Sophie?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "All over, really. Boarding school in Connecticut, college in L.A. A lot of places, but none that felt like mine." "That's a lonely answer." "Maybe." She looked out the window, watching snow gather on the convertible's hood. "Sometimes you just want to be somewhere that doesn't ask anything of you. Somewhere it can just be." Eli studied her for a moment. Her face was soft but thoughtful, as if every word came after a quiet edit in her mind. This wasn't a woman used to being seen for who she really was. Maybe no one had ever tried. "I think this town has room for folks like that," he said. They talked for nearly an hour, about music and old cars, and how Doris from the diner kept a bat behind the counter just in case. Sophie laughed more than she had in weeks, and Eli, though he didn't realize it yet, was already letting go of the invisible walls he usually kept around his heart. When Sophie finally stood to leave, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her expression darkened for a split second before she tucked it away without answering. "You okay?" Eli asked. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just work stuff, doesn't matter." He didn't press, but the shift in her demeanor lingered. As she pulled her coat back on, she paused. "You'll call me when the part comes in?" "Of course." "Should be here tomorrow or the day after?" She nodded, then walked to the door, but just before opening it, she turned around. "Hey, Eli?" "Yeah?" "Thanks for talking to me. You're real. That's nice." He offered a small smile. "I'm just a mechanic, Sophie." "No," she said softly. "You're something else." And with that, she was gone. Eli stood in the quiet of the shop long after she'd left, still holding the now empty coffee cup, his fingers wrapped around it like it was the only warm thing left in the room. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside, something had started to thaw. Something unexpected, something real. The radiator arrived the next morning, just after Eli finished replacing brake pads on a pickup from the lumber yard. He signed for the package, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and set it gently on the workbench. For a moment, he stared at the box, not because of what was inside, but because he knew what it meant. Sophie would be coming back. He wasn't sure why that thought tugged at him the way it did. Maybe it was the way she had listened, really listened, or the way her laughter had echoed in the quiet garage like music meant just for him. She returned just before noon, stepping inside with a smile that didn't feel rehearsed. Her red convertible was parked neatly out front, still dusted with yesterday's snow, its sleek design entirely out of place on the slushy road beside battered pickup trucks and aging Subarus. "Got your part in," Eli said casually, nodding toward the box. "Perfect," Sophie replied, brushing snowflakes from her shoulder. "I was starting to think I'd get snowed into this town for good." "Could be worse," he said. Doris would keep you fed, and Pete at the hardware store has a spare room above his shop. Bit drafty but clean. She smiled, stepping closer. You make it sound almost appealing. Eli raised a brow. You've clearly never stayed at Pete's. The two of them chuckled, and the air between them warmed, subtle and steady. Eli got to work, and Sophie stayed again, not out of necessity, but by choice. She leaned against the wall near the workbench, sipping coffee she'd brought for both of them. A new routine, unspoken but growing. You always fix cars by yourself? She asked, watching him work. Mostly, Eli replied without looking up. I had a guy for a while, but he moved to Denver, said he wanted a real job. She tilted her head. And this isn't? Eli looked up at her, surprised and pleased by the question. It is to me. Sophie watched him for a moment, her gaze softer now, her posture less guarded. I envy that, you know. Fixing radiators? No. Knowing who you are. Having something that feels grounded, real. He didn't know how to respond to that, not right away. He just nodded and turned back to the engine. The conversation shifted to music, then to food, then to places they'd never been. Sophie spoke of Paris like it was a memory she'd borrowed from someone else, and Eli described Yellowstone with reverence, though he'd only seen it once on a trip his dad took him on when he was 13. But something shifted when Sophie's phone rang. It was a sleek, expensive device, something that looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a greasy garage. The name on the screen flashed for a split second before she silenced it. Graham. Eli caught the flicker in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but tension. The moment she declined the call, the easy smile faded just slightly, and she knew he noticed. Everything all right? He asked gently. Yeah, she said quickly. Just work stuff. Eli didn't push, but the silence stretched between them for a beat too long. She sighed and looked away, eyes settling on the snow beginning to fall. Outside the garage window. You ever feel like people only see what they want to see? Eli wiped grease from his knuckles and leaned against the car. Sure, happens all the time. She nodded slowly. I've spent my whole life being seen. Just not really seen. Eli tilted his head, listening but not interrupting. My family's known, she began, choosing her words carefully. My father runs a hotel empire. You might have heard of it. Langston Properties. Eli blinked. Langston, as in Langston Resorts? The ones with those insane rooftop pools and six-figure memberships? She gave a half smile. That's the one. There was a pause. Not heavy, not awkward, just a shift in gravity. Something between them had tilted. I use my mother's maiden name when I travel, she explained. Keeps things simple, or at least it used to. Eli looked at her, but not with awe or suspicion. Just quiet understanding. So, what brings a Langston to Pine Creek in a snowstorm? Sophie let out a long breath. An engagement I didn't ask for, a life I'm supposed to want, and a moment of panic somewhere on I-70. He nodded slowly. So you ran? She met his gaze. Yeah, I ran. Eli didn't judge. He just stood there, steady as ever, arms crossed over his chest. You planning on going back? I don't know, she admitted. I just wanted to breathe, and then I ended up here. Eli gave a small chuckle. Well, this town may be small, but the air is clean. Sophie smiled. It's more than that. You don't know how rare it is to talk to someone who doesn't care who my father is, who doesn't try to sell me something or flatter me or ask for favors. You looked under the hood of my car, not under the label on my coat. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, a little flustered. I'm not exactly used to people calling me rare. Well, she said, stepping a little closer, maybe you should be. There it was again. That space between them, shrinking not in inches, but in trust. For the first time, Sophie had shared something real, something raw. And Eli had met it not with fear or fawning, but with quiet strength. By the time he finished installing the new radiator, the snow outside had thickened. The sky was a soft grey, the kind that held the promise of more snow to come. Sophie looked out at her now functional convertible and then back at Eli. "I should go," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Eli didn't answer. He just nodded. Not because he wanted her to leave, but because he understood that sometimes you had to let people find their own way. She reached for the door, paused, and turned back. "You ever think maybe the places we break down are the places we're meant to stop?" Eli's eyes met hers. "Sometimes the road brings you where you didn't know you needed to be." She smiled, a real one this time. Then she opened the door and stepped back into the snow, and Eli, standing alone in the warm hum of his garage, knew something had changed, not just in her, in him. The snow didn't let up for 2 days. Thick flurries swept through Pine Creek like a painter, brushing over every hard edge with white softness. Streets slowed, silence deepened, and time, as it often did during Colorado winters, seemed to fold in on itself. Sophie didn't leave town. She could have. The roads were open enough, her car perfectly functional again thanks to Eli. But she didn't. She kept finding reasons to stay. An excuse to try the pancakes at the diner, a thrift store she hadn't browsed yet, a local trail she was thinking of hiking, though she clearly hadn't packed for it. Eli didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. On the third morning, she showed up at the garage just after 10, with 2 cups of coffee and a box of old vinyl records she'd found at a second-hand shop. "You said you liked Johnny Cash," she said, setting them on the workbench like they belonged there. Eli raised an eyebrow. "I also said I don't have a record player." Sophie grinned. "Yet." And just like that, she'd slipped into his day again, not with force but ease. Like water finding cracks, in stone, gently reshaping what had always seemed unmovable. That afternoon, she sat on a stool while he worked on an ancient Chevy truck. The air smelled of motor oil and coffee, and outside the garage window, snow danced like it had nowhere else to be. Inside, the world had shrunk to the sound of Eli's tools and Sophie's soft laughter. "You ever do anything besides fix things?" she asked, watching him torque a bolt. Eli glanced up. "Fixing things is what I'm good at." "That's not what I asked." He leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands with a shop rag. "Used to play guitar. A little, my dad taught me, but I haven't picked it up in years." Sophie's eyes lit up. "You still have it?" He hesitated. "Somewhere. Probably under a pile of rags and regrets." "You should find it," Eli shrugged. "Maybe." But the idea stayed with him long after she left that evening. The next day, Sophie came by with sandwiches from the deli and a stack of old photos from her travels. Snapshots from Morocco, the Amalfi Coast, Tokyo in spring. Eli looked through them slowly, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle with the glossy paper. "You've seen a lot," he said. "I've visited a lot," she corrected. "Not the same thing." He looked up. She leaned against the wall, eyes distant. "You can be in the most beautiful places in the world and still feel like a stranger. It's not where you are. It's who you are when you're there." Eli nodded. "So who are you when you're here?" Sophie met his gaze. "Someone who doesn't feel like running." Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It was weighty in the best way. Like a moment that didn't need to be filled because it already was. That night, Eli went home and dug out his father's old guitar. The strings were rusted, the wood dry. He spent an hour tuning it, fingers fumbling, memories rising like dust from a forgotten shelf. When he finally strummed a chord, it rang out uneven but honest. He didn't tell Sophie, but the next day when she arrived, this time with no excuse, just a smile and a scarf pulled tight around her neck. He gestured toward the back room. "You said you wanted to hear it." She followed him in, past the garage clutter, to a small side room where Tom Turner had once kept his tools and old radio. The guitar rested on a stool, waiting. I didn't say I wanted to hear it, Sophie said with a smirk. I said you should find it. Eli picked it up anyway. He played softly, fingers stiff at first, then steadier as the music settled in. Just a few bars of an old folk tune, the kind his father used to hum while fixing carburetors. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glows, the hum of the garage now a distant memory. When he finished, she clapped lightly. See? Told you. He gave a small smile. You're not so bad at fixing things either. She tilted her head. Me? You're stitching something. Back together. Not sure what yet, but it's working. Sophie looked away, and for the first time, he saw her blink away something that looked like tears. That weekend, they spent a morning walking through the snowy trail behind the high school. Eli wore his father's old flannel jacket, and Sophie wore a beanie that didn't match her coat, but somehow suited her better than anything designer. They talked about things that mattered, the people they'd loved, the people they'd lost, and the versions of themselves they were still trying to grow into. Eli told her about his mother, who passed when he was 19, about how his dad never really recovered, just kept the garage running like it was the only thing holding him together. About how, when Tom passed 5 years ago, Eli couldn't leave, not because he was stuck, but because it still felt like home. Sophie listened without interruption. When he finished, she reached over and slipped her hand into his glove-covered one. Not as a statement, not as an invitation, but as a quiet gesture of belonging. They didn't kiss that day. Not yet. But something shifted, again, as it had each time they met. And this time, it stayed. Sophie returned to the garage just after noon the next day, bundled in a worn denim jacket she'd picked up at a local thrift shop. The once sleek woman with tailored coats and curated accessories had faded into someone more unassuming. Someone more real, Eli noticed. Not just the jacket, but the way she walked now. Slower, less guarded, as if she wasn't rushing toward something or running away, but simply being. You're early, he said as she stepped into the warm garage, brushing snow from her sleeves. I needed air, she replied, offering a small smile. And this place smells better than my motel room. Less bleach, more engine grease and burnt coffee. Well, Eli chuckled, we do specialize in ambience here. They fell into their usual rhythm, coffee, conversation, the hum of Eli's work filling in the spaces where words didn't need to go. Today, he was elbow deep in an old Harley-Davidson that belonged to one of the local deputies. Sophie watched him, perched on the stool near his workbench, eyes tracing the careful, practiced way his hands moved. She admired how present he was in everything he did, like each bolt he turned was as important as a heartbeat. You ever think about leaving Pine Creek? She asked, echoing a question he'd once asked her. Sometimes, he replied, not looking up, but it always feels like I'd be leaving something unfinished. Unfinished? My dad started this place, gave his whole life to it. Part of me still feels like I'm carrying his story forward. Sophie nodded slowly, as if filing that away in her mental ledger of Eli, a man shaped by loyalty, by legacy, by quiet endurance. You know, she said after a pause, in my world, legacy means something completely different. It's not about passing on values, it's about passing on power. Eli glanced up, brow furrowed. That sounds exhausting. It is. She took a breath, fingers laced in her lap. Do you know what my father said when I told him I didn't want to take over the company? Eli shook his head. He said, then what good are you? Words landed in the room like a wrench dropped from a great height. Eli stood still, hands frozen in place, eyes fixed on her. He didn't mean it to hurt me, Sophie added quickly, though her voice cracked. Or maybe he did. In that world, love is measured in returns, investment, performance, not presence. Eli set his tools down and stepped over, wiping his hands on a rag before sitting across from her. "That's not love, Sophie." "I know," she said, looking away, "but it's what I was raised on." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent, as if Eli knew not to fill it too quickly, like Sophie's words needed time to breathe, to settle in the space between them. He finally spoke. "You ever think about what you'd do if none of that mattered? If you weren't a Langston? If there were no expectations?" She gave a soft laugh. "I think about it every day I'm here." "And?" "I think I'd open a bookstore," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "A small one, somewhere quiet, sell paperbacks and coffee, recommend poetry to strangers who didn't ask for it." Eli grinned. "That actually sounds perfect." "You think so?" "Yeah, you'd be good at it." "Why?" "Because you'd show up, you'd care, and that's what people remember." Sophie blinked against the sting behind her eyes. "You know, most people think I'm either intimidating or fake." "Well, you're not fake," Eli said gently. "And intimidating?" He paused. "Maybe a little, but only when you wear those boots that look like they cost more than my truck." She laughed. Not politely, not carefully, but freely. The sound bounced around the garage like music that didn't need tuning. They spent the rest of the afternoon side by side, Sophie helping him sort parts, pretending to know what she was doing, Eli quietly enjoying her efforts. She asked questions about the tools, and he answered patiently, like a teacher who never expected his student to be interested, let alone enthusiastic. As dusk crept in, Eli flipped on the hanging light bulbs that gave the shop its amber glow. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence. "I should go," Sophie said at last, reluctantly standing. Eli walked her to the door, the space between them crackling again with unspoken things. "Hey," he said just before. She stepped outside. "You don't have to keep explaining yourself to me." She turned back, brows lifted. "I mean it," he continued. "You don't owe me reasons. I see you, not the name, not the money, just you." Sophie stared at him, her eyes searching, softening. Then she stepped forward and, without saying a word, leaned in and kissed him, just a brush of lips, light and tremulous. When she pulled back, Eli's heart was racing. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he murmured. "Not even a little." She smiled, then disappeared into the night, her footprints vanishing quickly in the falling snow. Eli stood in the doorway long after she was gone, the warmth of her kiss lingering on his lips, the echo of her pain still, humming in his chest. He didn't know exactly what they were building, not yet, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. The next morning the snow had stopped, but the air held a biting stillness, the kind of cold that crept into your bones, not through the wind, but through the silence. Eli had been up since before dawn, restless in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd swept the garage twice, reorganized his entire toolbox, and even fixed a creaky hinge on the back door that had squeaked for years, but nothing settled him. When Sophie finally arrived just after 10, she wasn't smiling. Her coat was buttoned, all the way up, her scarf wrapped tightly like armor. She walked with purpose, not grace, like someone preparing for something that might break her open. Eli felt it before she said a word. "Can we talk?" she asked, standing in the center of the garage like it wasn't the safe haven it had. "In the past week, but a stage where something fragile might shatter." "Of course," he said, motioning toward the office. "Come in where it's warm." She hesitated, then followed. The office was small, cluttered, and smelled faintly of motor oil and old coffee. But it was quiet, private. She stood by the window, her gloved fingers twitching at her sides. Eli waited. "I haven't been completely honest with you," she said finally, voice low. "You told me about your father, the company. That's not the whole of it." He stayed silent. Sophie took a deep breath. "I'm not just the daughter." Of a billionaire, Eli. I'm the heir, sole successor. Langston Properties, every hotel, every private island, every ridiculous penthouse in New York. It's all legally tied to me. The moment I turn 30, I take full control. Eli absorbed the words slowly, like oil spreading through cloth. Seeping, staining, changing things. I've known since I was 17, she continued. Board meetings, media training, image consultants, even my dating life, curated, reviewed, approved. Her voice cracked. I was supposed to get engaged this month to a man my father picked, someone who looks great in a tux and says all the right things and wouldn't blink at signing a prenup longer than a novel. She turned then, looking at Eli with something between shame and hope. I ran, Eli. I got in my car and just drove. I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to disappear, be no one, be me, if only for a while. Eli didn't speak. He just looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not the girl with the red convertible, not the beautiful stranger who brought him coffee and asked about his life, but the woman who had risked everything for a taste of freedom. She continued, You're probably wondering why I didn't just tell you sooner, but people look at me differently once they know. Everything becomes about what I have, not who I am. Eli finally stood, slow and deliberate. I don't care about your last name, Sophie. She blinked, startled. I care about the girl who laughs at my bad jokes, he said. The one who watches snow fall like it's the first time, who asks questions about carburetors she'll never use, who brought me grilled cheese and vinyl records and didn't flinch when I told her my whole life's been spent in this town. Tears welled in her eyes, unshed. But I won't lie to you, he added. This changes things, not who you are, but what's coming. She nodded, silent. You can hide in Pine Creek for a little while, he said gently. But eventually, that world you ran from, it's going to come looking. It already has, she whispered. Eli's jaw tightened. What do you mean? Graham, my father's advisor. He's been calling non-stop. He's in Denver now. It's only a matter of time before he shows up. And then what? She shook her head. I don't know, but I wanted you to hear it from me. Not from headlines, or some man in a black suit telling you I was never who you thought I was. He stepped closer. I've known exactly who you were since the day you walked in here. Sophie let out a shaky breath. And who's that? A woman who wants to live her own life, who's brave enough to walk away from everything just to remember how to breathe. She stared at him, eyes wide, lips parted. And, she asked, and that's the kind of woman worth standing beside. A single tear rolled down her cheek. I don't know what happens next, Eli. Me neither, he said softly. But I know you don't have to face it alone. Sophie exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for a week. They stood there in the quiet hum of the office, the snow still falling beyond the window, the air thick with things neither of them could predict. But in that moment, they weren't. Mechanic and billionaire. They weren't from different worlds. They were just two people, hearts open, pasts exposed, futures uncertain, and somehow that was enough. The kiss hadn't solved anything. It hadn't erased the chasm between their worlds, or the headlines Sophie feared, or the decades Eli had spent building walls around his heart, but it had done something even more dangerous. It had made hope real. Since that quiet night in the snow, something unspoken had stretched between them. It wasn't a declaration, but it pulsed in every glance, every quiet smile, every cup of coffee exchanged without a word, and yet they were both afraid. Sophie was the first to show up the next morning, cheeks flushed from the cold, but her smile held something unsure. I brought breakfast, she said, holding up a paper bag from the diner. Let me guess, Eli said, wiping his hands. Grilled cheese for breakfast? Don't judge me, she grinned. You're the one who drinks coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate together in the back office, legs brushing now and then, eyes meeting and darting away. like teenagers stumbling into love, only this time older, wiser, with scars too deep to ignore. Eli wanted to reach for her hand, but instead, he reached for his coffee. Something had shifted since the truth came out, not between them, not in the way that mattered, but around them. Like the air had grown heavier with the weight of what they were both trying not to say. "You okay?" he finally asked, studying her face. Sophie hesitated. "I don't know." "That's fair." She smiled faintly. "My whole life I've been trained to anticipate consequences, think 10 steps ahead, but this—" She looked at him. "This wasn't in the plan." Eli nodded. "Good things usually aren't." There was silence again. Not cold, not awkward, but thoughtful. Sophie leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan that spun lazily overhead. "Do you ever think about what people would say?" she asked. "About what?" "About this. Us." She paused. "If there is an us." Eli looked down at the cup in his hands. "I don't have much practice worrying about what people think. But yeah, sometimes." Sophie gave a tight smile. "In my world, perception is reality. Headlines write stories before the truth even gets a chance." "I'm not a headline kind of guy," he said quietly. "No, you're not. That's what scares me." That made him pause. "Me? Scare you?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Because you make it easy to forget what I'm supposed to be. You make me want things I've never let myself want. And that's a bad thing. It is when the rest of the world's waiting to tear it down." Eli stood, pacing slowly, toward the garage window, hands shoved into his back pockets. "You think I haven't thought about it too?" Sophie looked up. "I know what this looks like from the outside," he continued. "Poor mechanic, rich girl. Folks'll say I'm chasing a fairy tale, or worse, your money." "I would never think that," she said quickly. "I know," he replied, "but they might. And maybe that shouldn't matter. But it does. To me." Sophie rose slowly, walking to stand beside him. "You think I haven't dealt with that my whole life? People pretending to care, just to get close to the name. You're the first person who looked right through all of it. That scared me more than anything." They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, both staring out at the snow-covered lot, like it might hold an answer. "You know," Sophie said, "after a beat, my mother used to say the best kind of love is the kind that terrifies you, because it means it's real." Eli turned to her. "And your father?" She laughed dryly. "He said love's a liability. Then I guess I'm a liability." Sophie tilted her head, eyes searching his face. "You'd risk that? For this?" Eli didn't speak right away. Instead he reached out. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, and took her hand, held it gently. "I've lived 39 years safe," he said. "Careful, predictable, fixing cars, not letting anyone get close. I've been alone so long I forgot what it was like to want someone beside me." Sophie squeezed his hand. "And now I want it. I want you. But I also know life isn't a snow globe. We don't get to freeze this moment. The world's going to come knocking, Sophie. I know. And when it does, I need to know you won't walk away." She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped closer until there was nothing but the quiet space between their breathing. "I don't know what's coming," she whispered, "but I know I don't want to go through it without you." He didn't kiss her then. He didn't need to. They just stood there, wrapped in silence, in shared fear, in the fragile beginning of something braver than either of them had dared hope for. But outside the window, unnoticed, a black SUV rolled slowly past the shop. The kind of car that didn't belong in Pine Creek. Its windows were tinted, its engine too quiet, its presence too purposeful. It didn't stop, but it didn't need to. The world was coming. Eli knew something was coming before it arrived. It was in the way Sophie grew quieter each day, glancing at her phone before silencing it. It was in the tension behind her smile, the way she lingered in the doorway longer than necessary, as if Stepping back into the world meant stepping away from something she couldn't bear to lose, but it was also in the way the town watched. Pine Creek had always been a place of nods and short conversations, of men tipping their hats and women lingering in aisles just to ask how your mother was. But word traveled fast, and the sight of a beautiful stranger in designer boots spending her afternoons with the town's most eligible and perpetually single mechanic was enough to start whispers. Still, Eli might have weathered all of it, the looks, the questions, even the self-doubt, if it hadn't been for the man in the suit. It happened on a Thursday. The sky was the color of old tin, low and heavy with snow that hadn't yet fallen. Sophie hadn't shown up that morning, and Eli had told himself she was just sleeping in, or maybe exploring the town again, but the pit in his stomach said otherwise. He was adjusting the alignment on a customer's truck when the garage door creaked open and a sharp, clipped voice cut through the air. Eli Turner. Eli turned. The man standing in the entryway didn't belong. His coat was tailored, his shoes untouched by slush, and his expression was all edges. Business, not curiosity. "I'm Graham Whitaker," the man said, stepping forward. "I'm with Langston Holdings." Eli wiped his hands slowly, cautiously. "You're looking for Sophie." "I'm here for Miss Langston, yes," Graham replied, tone clipped. "I believe you know her under different terms." Eli crossed his arms. "She's not here, I'm aware. She asked me not to follow her. I respected that for a time. But she has responsibilities, Mr. Turner. A name. A future that doesn't include hiding in small towns with people like you." The words hit like a slap, not because of what was said. Eli had heard worse, but because of what it implied, that he didn't belong in her life, that no matter what they'd shared, it was temporary. A footnote. "I'm not keeping her here," Eli said calmly. "She came on her own." "Of course she did," Graham replied, not unkindly, but without an ounce of respect. "Sophie's always been impulsive, but she's also intelligent, and she'll come to her senses soon." Eli stared at him, jaw tightening. "She's not a piece of property, Mr. Whitaker. She gets to decide who she is." Graham gave a small, practiced smile. "And I believe she will, but decisions carry consequences. She has an empire to inherit, investors to reassure, a reputation to uphold." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm here as a courtesy, because I believe you care about her. And if that's true, the best thing you can do, for both of you, is let her go." Eli didn't answer. He didn't have to. The door closed softly behind Graham, but the weight he left behind lingered long after. That night, Sophie returned. She didn't knock, didn't announce herself, just stepped into the garage with snow in her hair and sadness in her eyes. "No, he came," she said quietly. Eli nodded, still seated on the stool near the workbench. "I told him not to. Told him I needed time, space. But that's not how that world works." Eli looked at her, voice steady. "He said you'd come to your senses." Sophie gave a hollow laugh. "Of course he did. He's been managing me since I was old. Enough to sign a contract." She sat beside him, close but not touching. "He said I should let you go," Eli added carefully. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then softly, "What do you think?" "I think I don't want to," Eli said, staring at his hands. "But I also think he's not wrong." Sophie turned sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means I can't compete with private jets and boardrooms, Sophie. I don't belong in your world, and no matter how much I want you, I can't pretend this doesn't change things." "So what, Eli? We just give up, walk away because it's hard?" "No," he said gently. "But maybe we ask if this is real or just a moment out of time." Sophie stood abruptly, the hurt flashing across her face. "It's real to me." "I know," he said. "It's real to me too. But I'm not going to be the guy who holds you back from everything you've worked for, who keeps you hidden in a garage while the world expects you to stand on top of it." She stepped closer, voice trembling. I never asked for that world. But it's yours. Sophie stared at him, eyes glassy. So what are you saying? Eli took a breath, every word hurting more than the last. I'm saying maybe we were a pause. A beautiful, impossible pause. She stood there, stunned. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Not angry, not dramatic, just broken. Like something inside her had finally cracked. The garage felt colder after she left. Quieter, worse than empty, echoing with everything they hadn't said. Eli sat there for a long time, the wrench still in his hand, the snow falling outside, erasing her footprints before he had the courage to follow them. The days after Sophie left were quieter than Eli thought possible, not just in sound, but in spirit. The clang of tools, the hum of the heater, even the rumble of engines as customers came and went, all of it felt hollow. He went through, the motions like a man underwater, each breath heavy, each movement slower than it should have been. But it wasn't just grief. It was absence, absence of laughter, spilling over coffee, absence of wide eyes, asking questions about engines she had no interest in, absence of warmth that had nothing to do with space heaters or sun through the windows, but everything to do with a woman who had changed the temperature of his world. Eli didn't talk about it. Not to Doris, who watched him with worried eyes from behind the diner counter, not to Pete, who offered him a beer and a knowing nod, but said nothing more. Pine Creek didn't need words to know when something had broken. The worst part was, he didn't even blame her. She had done the impossible, stepped out of a gilded life into a town of a few hundred people, hoping to disappear, and ended up being seen for the first time. But seeing wasn't always enough. And Eli? He'd done the thing he swore he wouldn't. He let her go, not because he stopped caring, but because he didn't know how to care without stepping in her way. That was a week ago. He hadn't heard from her since. It was a Tuesday morning, skies overcast and promising more snow, when the reminder of her finally returned, not in person, but in the form of a child. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9, walked shyly into the garage, her cheeks flushed from the cold, holding something wrapped. "In a scarf. Are you Eli?" she asked. He wiped his hands. "Yeah, that's me." "This is for you," she said, offering him the bundle. He knelt to her level. "Who's it from?" "She said her name's Sophie," the girl replied. "She stayed at my aunt's motel. She gave me $5 and said to make sure you got this." Eli unfolded the scarf slowly. Inside was a small, dog-eared journal, the kind you'd buy at an airport bookstore, soft leather, pages frayed at the edges. Tucked between the first pages was a note, handwritten. "I didn't know how to say goodbye, so I wrote instead. I thought running from my world would give me peace. But I didn't expect to find home in a garage, or kindness in a pair of oil-stained hands. I miss your laugh. I miss your steadiness. But more than that, I miss the person I was when I was with you. If you ever want to find me, I'll be in the city. But I won't be hiding anymore. S." Eli stared at the note for a long time, fingers trembling slightly. In the quiet of the garage, the world shifted again. He sat for hours that day, the journal beside him, replaying every moment they'd shared, not just the kisses or the conversations, but the small things, the quiet things, the real things. And slowly, something turned inside him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was clarity. He'd spent so long believing love meant holding back, that being noble meant stepping aside, that sacrifice was the price of goodness. But Sophie hadn't needed a hero. She'd needed a partner, someone to stand beside her, not step out of the way. That night, Eli went home and packed a small bag. Jeans, flannel shirts, the leather jacket his father left him. He didn't leave a note. Pine Creek would understand. The next morning, he filled the tank of his old truck and turned it toward the interstate. For the first time in years, he drove. Out of town without looking back. Not because he was leaving something behind, but because he was moving toward something that finally made sense. Meanwhile, in New York City, Sophie stood at the window of her penthouse, staring out at the skyline that once felt like her prison. Now, it felt empty. Her phone buzzed again. Another meeting reminder. Another email from PR. Another invitation to a gala she had no intention of attending. She'd done everything right since returning, answered questions, smiled for cameras, reassured investors that her little detour had been a brief vacation, nothing more, but it was all a performance. Every room felt colder, every word rehearsed, and every time someone called her Miss Langston, it echoed like a name that no longer belonged to her. The journal sat on her nightstand, pages half full, corners bent. She reread her note to Eli every night, hoping he'd understand, hoping he'd forgive her. Not for leaving, but for not being brave enough to stay. But she never expected him to follow. So when her doorman called her apartment and said, "There's a man downstairs, says he's looking for Sophie Langston, drives a truck that doesn't belong on Fifth Avenue," her heart stopped. She didn't change clothes. She didn't fix her makeup. She just ran for the elevator. And when the doors opened to the marble lobby and she saw him, flannel shirt, road-dusted boots, that same steady gaze, she couldn't move. Eli stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket. A wrench. "Small, clean, familiar. You left this in the passenger seat," he said, voice quiet. Sophie laughed, a real one, sudden and bright, and the tears came with it. "Eli, what are you doing here?" He smiled. "Came to fix something." Sophie stood in the grand marble lobby, her breath catching as Eli took one slow step forward. The echo of his boots on the polished floor sounded impossibly loud in the hush of the room, as if even the building itself had paused to listen. He looked just as she remembered. Flannel sleeves rolled at the forearms, jeans worn at the knees, a calm steadiness in his eyes that hadn't wavered despite the chaos of the city around him. But there was something else now, too. Something she hadn't seen before, a kind of certainty. She blinked, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and hope. "You came." Eli nodded, pulling the small wrench from his pocket again and holding it out to her with a crooked grin. "You left this. Figured it was an excuse to come find you." She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. "That's the best excuse I've ever heard." They stood there for a long beat, the silence thick with the weight of everything that had happened. The garage, the words left unsaid, the heartbreak they'd both lived in separately. Sophie finally spoke, voice softer. "How did you find me?" "You left me a map," Eli said, tapping the cover of the journal still tucked in his coat. "Wasn't hard to follow." She smiled faintly, eyes glassy. "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't think I would either," he admitted. "But then I realized something." Sophie looked at him, waiting. "I've spent my whole life being careful, fixing things, making sure nothing ever broke too badly. But the best thing that ever happened to me was something I couldn't control. You." Her breath caught. "I thought letting you go was the right thing," Eli continued. "I thought I was protecting you, but I wasn't giving you a choice, and I wasn't giving me one either." Sophie stepped forward, close enough now to hear the hitch in his breathing. "And now? Now I know that love's not about staying out of the way. It's about showing up, even when it's scary, especially then." She reached for his hand and held it tight. "I'm scared too, Eli." "I know," he whispered, "but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." Tears spilled over her lashes then, quiet and unashamed. She leaned in and rested, her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. They didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. The city around them buzzed and blurred, but inside that embrace, time stopped. The girl who had once run from everything and the man who had once buried himself in solitude had somehow found their way to the middle, where truth lived, where healing began. Eventually, Sophie pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You should see the look on the concierge's face," she said through a teary laugh. Eli glanced over her shoulder and chuckled. "I don't think he sees many guys with dirt under their nails. I like that about you," she said. "You like the dirt. I like that you never pretended to be anything else." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "So, what now?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I still have responsibilities, expectations, but I'm done letting them dictate who I get to be. And who do you want to be?" She took a deep breath. "Someone who doesn't hide. Someone who's not afraid to want a simpler life. Someone who opens that bookstore we talked about, with mismatched furniture and second-hand paperbacks." Eli nodded, eyes twinkling. "Coffee machine in the back?" "Of course. Room for a mechanic who plays guitar badly on weekends," she smiled. "That's a requirement." He paused, then said, "You don't have to give up everything." "Sophie, I'm not asking you to. I just want to build something with you, wherever that is." Sophie took his hand again, firmer this time. "Then let's build it, not in hiding, not in fear, just real." Outside, snow began to fall, not heavy like in Pine Creek, but soft, almost uncertain. It drifted past the towering glass of the penthouse windows, settling quietly on the city below. Later that night, they walked through Central Park, their hands intertwined, boots crunching through thin layers of frost. Eli looked up at the skyscrapers, the lights, the pace of it all, and marveled not at the city, but at the woman beside him. "You really lived in all this?" he asked. Sophie laughed. "Lived is a strong word." "Well," he said, nudging her playfully, "you've got good taste in snow." She looked at him, eyes shining in the cold. "And better taste in company." They paused at a bench dusted with powder, sat down, and let the quiet of the park wrap around them. For once, neither felt like they had to fill the space. Love had made a home in the silence. Eli finally broke it, voice low and warm. "I'm not sure where we go from here, Sophie, but I'm not afraid to find out." She leaned her head on his shoulder, heart full. "Me neither." And above them, the snowfall continued, a second chance falling quietly from the sky. Spring came late to Pine Creek that year. The snow lingered longer than usual, as if reluctant to let go, like the last pages of a good book, holding on before the final word. But inside Turner Auto Repair, everything had changed. The walls were still the same chipped grey. The heater still rattled when it kicked on. The old coffee maker still brewed with a wheeze. But there was music now. Soft, lazy guitar strings drifting from the back office. And laughter, always laughter. Sophie sat cross-legged on the garage floor, flipping through a box of spark plugs like they were playing cards. "You know," she said, lifting one with a smirk, "this looks suspiciously like the one you claimed. Didn't exist when I asked about it 6 months ago." Eli glanced over his shoulder, wiping grease from his hands. "Back then, I was trying to keep you from asking too many questions." "You failed," she said, tossing it gently at him. "I did," he agreed, catching it easily, "but I think it worked out anyway." It had been 3 months since she returned to Pine Creek for good, not as a runaway heiress, but as Sophie Langston, woman, friend, dreamer, and bookstore owner. Yes, the bookstore. The quiet shelf, tucked between Doris's diner and the old post office, had opened just 2 weeks prior. Painted a soft sage green with mismatched shelves and handwritten labels, it already felt like it had been part of the town forever. Locals came in for paperbacks and stayed for conversation. There was even a mechanic's pick of the week shelf curated by Eli, which mostly featured westerns, repair manuals, and one unexpected poetry collection. He swore he didn't cry reading it. Sophie never believed him. Their days had become a quiet rhythm, mornings at the garage, afternoons at the shop, evenings spent cooking simple meals in Sophie's rented cottage just outside town. The life they built wasn't flashy. It wasn't made for headlines or gala invitations, but it was theirs. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Eli closed up shop early. The last customer had driven off with a fresh set of tires and a pie from Sophie as thanks. He washed up, grabbed his guitar, and headed toward town. When he entered the quiet shelf, Sophie was sitting behind the counter, legs propped up, reading aloud to a boy no older than 8. And then the little prince said, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." The boy blinked up at her. "What does that mean?" Sophie smiled. "It means sometimes the best things in life don't look like much, but they feel like everything." Eli lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene. The boy, the book, the warmth, and Sophie. Always Sophie. Later that night, as they sat on the back porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, stars thick above them, Sophie reached for his hand. "I used to think I had to choose," she said softly, "between being someone my father could be, proud of, and someone I could live with, between wealth and simplicity, between love and legacy. And now I know I was asking the wrong question." Eli turned toward her, gently brushing a wind-blown strand of hair from her face. "What was the right one?" "Not what I had to give up," she whispered, "but what I was finally ready to hold on to." He leaned in and kissed her. Not urgently, not like a movie ending, but like a promise made quiet and sure. When they pulled apart, Sophie laughed softly. "You know, technically I'm still a billionaire." "Technically," Eli replied, grinning, "but I prefer you in flannel and bookstore ink." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart full. "Do you ever miss the way things were?" Eli shook his head. "No. I miss the idea of them sometimes. The quiet, the safety. But life with you is the kind of noise I never knew I needed." They sat in silence after that, letting the breeze and stars speak for them. And somewhere between the moonlight and the guitar resting at his side, Eli began to play. A quiet tune, one Sophie had never heard before, but one that felt like home. He didn't need lyrics, she already knew the words. In the distance, wind chimes danced softly, a dog barked, a neighbor's porch light flicked on. Life, as it always did, moved forward, gently, insistently, and in that little corner of Colorado, tucked between pine trees and possibility, a poor mechanic and a secret billionaire didn't just fall in love. They chose it, over and over again, every day. Because the richest life wasn't one filled with gold, but one filled with goodness. And sometimes the greatest love stories didn't start with fate. They started with a flat tire, and someone who cared enough to stop and fix it. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment and tell me your country or city. It's always so special to see how far these stories travel. And if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss a moment of inspiration, love, or healing. This channel is all about kindness, hope, and the quiet magic of everyday people. And I'm so grateful you're part of this growing family. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, take care of yourself and each other.